Right, okay. Yeah, yeah. I think we need to start so that we keep up to time. I've one or two household announcements which I've been asked to make. First of all, very straightforward things, but can you please make sure that you wear these lanyards all the time so that people know who each other are, as it were. The normal thing is your mobile phone turned off. I always have mine turned off to silent. My wife said the other day, such an important call was coming through, I should turn it on. So I did, and we were in the most silent restaurant I've ever been in my life, and I'd put it on outdoor mode. Anyway, there you go. No smoking. If anyone wants to smoke, they need to smoke outside. And then just a few things we didn't say last night. The working groups are intended to allow for extended individual participation. And I think you've been pre-assigned to a group, and there's been a real effort to try and mix us all up. And the same group meets on both days and is going to be given a task, so there's some focus to the discussion. And that's today and tomorrow. There's the delegate wall, which is a visible place where the bookshop is. By the way, all books on the bookshop virtually are at least 20% off. I've been asked to do an advert. The delegate wall is somewhere where you can just stick things up if you want to put a post-it there. All of those will be gathered at the end of the conference to try and put together, as we eventually produce over the next few months, a report on the what's happened. You can contribute to the blog. I think there's a sign telling you that. And do engage with the ongoing research process. I hope that's covered everything that I needed to cover. Now it remains for me to introduce Anna. Anna is going to speak for about 25-30 minutes, and that'll give us some time for discussion together. And the idea of these sessions is not simply to focus on the platform, so to speak, although I'm sure there'll be questions of clarification and so on, and there may be specific things you want to ask Anna, but really it's to try and engage with each other in the way we began to do a little bit last night, even in that introduction of each person making their own introduction. Anna, her day work, as it were, is at King's College London, and I'm not going to read out the piece because you have it on your paper, but she's also still has an honorary fellowship at St Edmunds in Cambridge. We look very much forward to what she's saying. It's absolutely dead centre on what this conference is about. So over to you, Anna.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Bishop Stephen, and also Jenny, who came all the way down to London to persuade me that I had to come to this conference. So I'm yet another one of Jenny's victims. I'm also very impressed that at this very early stage in the conference, you've given the floor to a Mancunian, which is always a very risky thing to do. But on a serious note, I couldn't be more honoured as a Mancunian, as a Catholic, as somebody married to an Anglican, and who teaches on the relationship between the Anglican and Catholic political and social traditions, to be here today. And I'm also very conscious that as I look out around the room, there are many people here who've been my inspiration. I was a baby, only just a baby, when Shepherd and Warlock came to Liverpool. So my lifetime has been really since they began to shape our culture and our churches. 6 months ago, I was involved in a conference in London. It was a little like this one, in that it gathered together a group of highly motivated, diverse people wanting to share insights from their work, as well as to seek confirmation of a wider shared vision that was greater than the sum total of their parts. The difference was that those attending that conference and running the workshop were school pupils aged between 8 and 18 from across London schools. It was a refreshing change for me to revert to being a pupil whilst these young people taught us about the common good. They did not use that phrase, but every word they said during the course of the day was entirely about that value and practice. They captured my attention. In fact, more importantly, they captured my imagination in a way quite different to much talk about the common good that I tend to hear. They began their workshop by setting us an unlikely task. We were not asked to discuss the problems of our neighbourhoods and start proposing solutions, or even to spend time getting to know each other, even though the day was about community organising. Instead, we were asked to write a poem. I confess that I was a little taken aback. Each line of the poem began with the phrase, "I am." We were given reflective prompts for the lines of our poem, some serious, some rather more humorous. And the adults together were then asked to slightly awkwardly read our poems aloud. The pupils were rerunning for us adults an English lesson that had been their entry into community organising and thinking about the common good. Now, writing poetry may sound a curious way to motivate students from a fairly deprived community in North London to engage in shaping their communities. Not at all. Their teacher told us what she had learnt, that the first step to motivating these students to act in their communities had been to stimulate their imaginations, to awaken a deeper sense of who they were and of what they were capable, to discover something, she said, of their mystery, their dignity, and their humour, without giving back to them that which much of their life experience had taken away. They would find it difficult to find the passion to act for change. And change their communities they had. They didn't wait for others. They got on with sorting out the dysfunctional school bus service themselves. They joined living wage campaigns and much else besides. I think on reflection that their teacher had it right. The politics and the practice of the common good begins not with problems and solutions, but with recognition and with imagination. Rowan Williams talks about the imaginative force of art and religion as the two great examples of what he calls the non-secular, not the anti-secular, the non-secular. What he means by this is that religion and art, poetry in the case of those Brent pupils, communicates and awakens the value of being human in more than just functionalist terms. Religion and art exceed and challenge the secular. The vision of the common good, although entirely practical and social, does not start with a list of problems. The beginning of all Christian social and political action is found outside of politics itself, in a place of deep imagination, in an I am rather than an I do. The tradition of Catholic social teaching from which I come, and which has long championed the idea of the common good, provides precisely such a stimulus to our imagination. We are often told that the common good is about neighbour love, and of course it is. But the common good begins with some prior theological thinking. It begins with a recognition not of what I have to do, but of who I am as a created being. Thomas Aquinas tells us that our true common good, from a Christian point of view, is life in communion with God. And in order to prepare ourselves to share in that life of communion, we are given, both in our nature and through grace, the means to live together a pale imitation of that life of the common good in the here and the now. I am a person created in the image of a triune God, created for relationship, in fact more than relationship, interdependence with God and my neighbour. Our social and political life is part of the goodness of that creation. One of the gifts of the Catholic social tradition, of which I am most proud, is that it sees our political instincts as part of goodness, goodness in and for which we were made. Politics for Catholics can never totally be a matter of despair. However much politics may fail the gospel, we cannot give way to a view of politics as only ever dirty or squalid. Politics is necessary, both because of the best of who we are and the worst of that which we are capable. At its root, politics and faith are mutual expressions of the question, what life do we wish, or are we called, to live together? What non-secular faith gives to secular politics is a vision of the very purpose of politics in the life of the common good. The beginning and the end of politics, then, is the common good, an integrated life together. What makes a Christian account of the common good distinct from the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number is the biblical option for the poor, or as David Shepherd preferred, the bias for the poor. In the street where I live, when I woke up the other morning, there was some very interesting street graffiti that had arrived overnight, and it was rows of little people coloured in white and blue and yellow, and by the side of each row of people was a word: neighbourliness, street buzz, safety. They were words that I think in my community are common good words. And then the following day, somebody had come back and added another line on the bottom, social ties, as if they'd somehow forgotten that in the earlier stages of the process. And that for me was actually very revealing, because although the words were very nice that they'd put on the street graffiti, there was something very important about neighbourliness, a bias for the poor, and a fundamental relationship that they'd missed off the earlier stages of their street graffiti. The common good is therefore measured by the well-being and participation of the least. And this is not just about material poverty. It is, as one Catholic economist points out, a multiplication sum and not a simple sum of addition. The common good is a multiplication sum and not simply a sum of addition. If the input of the least into the common good is zero, then the sum remains zero. Having boasted a little of the gift of Catholic social teaching for thinking about the common good, now to say clearly, this vision of the common good is of course not just Catholic. Catholics may have kept the particular language of the common good alive through its social teaching, but this is a shared Christian vision rooted in gospel and tradition. For David Shepherd, the resources of such thinking came through the worldview connected to urban mission, for Derek Warlock, from Catholic social teaching. American public theologian Jim Wallis opens his most recent book on why evangelical Christians should care about the common good with this statement: "It's time to find a better vision of our life together. Politics is failing to solve the biggest problems our world now faces, and the disillusionment with elections and politicians has gone global. Politicians continue to focus on blame instead of solutions, winning instead of governing, ideology instead of civility. But cynicism cannot be our response to failed politics. Instead, we must go deeper." The common good is an ancient idea which belongs to us all and whose time has urgently come. For him, for Wallis that is, an evangelical account of the common good is rooted not in Catholic social teaching formally, but in Matthew 25 and in the story of the Good Samaritan, in the command to exercise neighbour love. I want to suggest to you, by way of a conversation starter for 10, just 2 initial reasons, and the expectation is you'll be adding more, why this language of the common good is needed. The first reason why I think the language of the common good is needed is that it seeks to be a way of speaking and acting which unites rather than divides, a way of speaking and acting that unites rather than divides. It is, in its origin and essence, a language, an imagination of relationship. Some theologians have talked of the common good as a grammar, a structure that enables a Christian way of speaking, thinking, and acting together. We are, I believe, surrounded by divisive language. the language of market, of political interests, even some of the language around rights and justice can become competitive and acquisitive. Very much of the political language that has been shaping our public conversations in austere times has been divisive rather than unitive. The deserving versus the undeserving, strivers versus skivers. This kind of language comes to dominate our public spaces, and it fails to nurture our imagination. It fails to provide any nutrients towards a life lived together. The common good is an integrating language which mirrors for Christians the nature and the life of Christ. Because we are kin of Christ, we are kin of each other. The language of kindness is connected to the language of kinship. Theologian Janet Soskis argues that we Christians have worn smooth our metaphors of kinship over the centuries. Like a great marble staircase made smooth by use, we can glide over the language of kinship. We can lose our sense of being shocked and scandalized by what kinship with Christ means for our worshipping life together and for our political life. The second reason why I think we need the language and practice of the common good is connected to the first. The common good speaks of human value rather than human function. It therefore provides a necessary challenge to all forms of public and private action which seek to reduce the human body and human relationships to no more than functions and interests, costs or benefits. The common good is a form of language that speaks of value. It contains words that help us speak publicly of suffering and pain, as well as optimism and hope. It also, I have learned through the japes of community organising, has a wicked sense of humour. Speaking of human value and relationships makes the things that the market and state speaking of human value and relationships makes the things that the market and state makes invisible, visible. When Jenny asked me to speak, she asked me whether I would make the common good thinking concrete by taking a particular issue or question. So I want to talk about immigration. There are many ways in which we will make the themes of the common good practical this weekend. You will have your own stories and experiences where your imagination and passion is stirred towards the common good. I want to talk about immigration for two reasons here. Firstly, because I'm sharing with you my story of passion for the common good, and because talking about this example enables us to see just how challenging Christian thinking about the common good is for our politics. So if immigration is not your common good passion, if yours is housing or debt, social enterprise, race or gender, wages or work, think with me as I speak about how this one example helps us to think about a politics of the common good. And perhaps as I speak, think about how you would illustrate and talk about your own area of passion for the common good. Immigration is a hot political topic. For the last decade, it has continued to poll in the top 3 political issues which voters tell the government they care about. In some areas of the country, tensions between migrants and established communities can be high. All of the main political parties have been told by the pollsters that they must do something to show that they are willing to safeguard British jobs, to reduce pressure on public services within communities, and to deal with the perceived failures of multiculturalism, and above all, to show that they can deter more people from seeking a life in the UK. There is an awkward public non-conversation happening right now about immigration, in which everyone is perceived to be talking about immigration, but each seems to believe that no one else really understands what they're trying to say. Want to raise questions about immigration and you're labelled a racist. Defend migration and you're a privileged urban liberal without a clue. In the middle of the chatter are migrants themselves for whom the current system does not seem to work much either. Report after report explores the inhumanity and inefficiency of the system that they have no choice but to negotiate. It is a very complicated situation to make sense of, and one of the dangers is talking about the common good without noting the details of differences and difficulties of conflict between goods, as well as an overall common good. I want to point out two basic things about the way that the common good tends to be thought of in the current public debate about immigration. Then I want to say something briefly about the ways that a Christian account of the common good turns that logic on its head. I hope you will recognise these statements. The fair or moral purpose of immigration policy is to ensure that only migration that is in the British national interest, i.e. economic interest, should be allowed or encouraged. We need clear policies that offer a preferential option for British workers and which bring in the most highly qualified that we can recruit from abroad. We should take some refugees, but probably not the levels we currently take. Standing up for appropriate national self-interest means public policy should be such that it largely deters immigration to the UK, especially amongst unskilled and low-skilled economic workers and those seeking refugee status. We should also enforce removals on those here who cannot achieve clear legal status quickly. We need practical policies that enact this deterrence. Hence, over the summer, we discovered the naming internally of the government's Hostile Environment Working Group, whose task was to deter migrants from coming, the Hostile Environment Working Group, and also the now famous and ridiculed Go Home vans. I hope you heard the story of the man who phoned from one area of London asking whether or not he could be taken back home to another part of London, explaining that he didn't have a visa in order to get from East London to Willesden, and was informed that he didn't need a visa for that journey. Christian common good thinking about immigration does not begin or end with the category of national interest, unlike that characterisation that I've just given. It does not dismiss the idea of a national community, but it begins with questions of human value, and it sets immigration within a wider Christian imagination and story. And that story begins with a recognition of some very basic parts of the biblical tradition. A biblical command to honour the dignity of each person, to offer particular hospitality and care for the stranger, and to recognise our universal kinship through Christ beyond national borders. We might note the way in which migrants in Scripture have a privileged role. God sometimes actually instructs people to become migrants, Abraham being our classic example. God often calls migrants to be prophets and truth-tellers to a culture which has lost its way, like Ruth, for example. And Christ himself comes among us as a kind of migrant. Migration is not, first and foremost, viewed as a problem in the Bible, although for many it does bring great suffering. And the first category of Christian thinking is not national interest. Rather, migration is seen as a basic feature of the human condition, and indeed more than that, it is an epiphany, a revealing of the nature of the life of faith itself. Such a Christian imagination might set the tone, but it doesn't tell us how we're to resolve the very painful modern dilemmas, the conflict between goods that dealing with contemporary migration in a global era requires. At one level, answering that question is a task that belongs to the whole community. It's not for the church alone to determine the answer to that question, but we do have resources to help us think more practically about the common good and immigration from our tradition. Catholic social teaching has built on this biblical background to propose some principles that can help bridge our scripture and our context. And they are, I hope you will agree, rather different to the principles that seem to guide the policy conversation at the moment. Firstly, the purpose of immigration policy in Catholic social teaching must have the dignity of the human person at its heart. In a world of nation states, we all require the protection of some form of state. We can't really exist for very long without this. Political membership is not a luxury. Political membership is a basic necessity. Secondly, where people are displaced from that membership by conflict, persecution, violence, or hunger, the person has an absolute right to seek sanctuary elsewhere. Because political membership is so basic to all forms of economic and physical well-being, when deciding who to let in and who not to let in, Catholic social teaching suggests a priority for refugees over wealthy economic migrants. Thirdly, Catholic social teaching believes that the common good is best served by placing a strong moral obligation on the most materially prosperous states to receive, protect and integrate the migrant. In other words, we should be looking to probably take slightly more of our share rather than less of our share based on our position in the world. And that's true of both economic and refugee migrants. The state may, of course, set limits to how many people it receives, but it must have a fair process for making its decisions, balancing the resources of the national community so that they are balancing the established population with newly arriving migrants. Fourthly, national borders and identities, whilst important to us all, are a good only when they provide for both an ordered and peaceful way of life and make hospitality to others possible. And here government has an important mediating role, as do the institutions of church and society. It's not only the government's role to manage integration, it's something that belongs at every level of community and society. We have to be able to maximise the hospitality we offer without causing unnecessary suffering. Fifthly, migrants have cultural and social as well as political rights. They have a right to work because work is basic to our human dignity, and a right to some form of civic participation. Just like thinking on the living wage, the minimum conditions for survival include ways to participate in established communities, not just the means for bare survival. These principles have led the churches of all denominations to be at the forefront of challenging the detention of children for immigration purposes, at the forefront of challenging the unlimited detention of adults and the conditions endured by those in detention. Also to campaigning against the brutality of enforced removals. In more positive terms, they've campaigned, because of this vision, for a right to work for those whose decisions might take years and years and years and years. They've also campaigned for the regularisation of undocumented migrants. I remember very well Austin Ivory's phrase after the Strangers into Citizens campaign. He said to me, "We won the conversation, but we lost the politics." How is it possible in the context of the common good to win the conversation and lose the politics? Yet the common good points to internal issues within our communities as well as external. Churches have been places that have provided a different kind of context for migrants. So this isn't all about the state. More importantly is what we do within the life of our own communities. Our churches have been contexts in which migrants have found a home, a welcome, and a different kind of citizenship because we don't check their passports or their papers when they turn up to church. Instead, there is a context of participation, not only in prayer and worship, but in the social, cultural, and political life of a congregation. We have structured civil societies within our churches as countercultures to the dominant civil society at our doors. But we cannot rest easy with the contrast between those two civil societies. This is a reminder that the common good is first and foremost something that we witness through the vibrant and creative lives of our own communities. I said that my example needn't have been about immigration. We could have performed a similar analysis on penal policy or mental health, on the living wage, on how we relate labour to capital, on the role of money, on youth unemployment, or housing, or food poverty, or the environment. And the invitation of this weekend is for you to add your reflections and your experience and your passion and imagination for questions of the common good to that list. All I've done is shared with you one of mine. All these are common good questions. All of them challenge our faith life. None of them have easy solutions, but our politics and our economics are at the core of every single one of those questions. And here we see, I really think, that our kinship language, from a Christian perspective, does change things. What a difference it makes to think first with the imagination of the common good, rather than the imagination of market, nation, or state alone. I've talked a lot about church and Christian theology, but the common good cannot be contained only in talk of Christians relating to each other. It implies endlessly creative partnerships between individuals, institutions, and associations who can honestly share something of the vision that I've been talking about. And in fact, more than that, it's not just a question of opting into partnership, because in truth, no faith, no political party, no campaigning association can be or do the common good alone. We can be good, but that's not the common good. The politics of the common good is necessarily plural and spacious. For this reason, I want to finish this morning by saying something more personal about generous ways of living the common good. I started by telling you that I'd been challenged and inspired by a group of London pupils, and I was. What I didn't say was that the pupils running the workshops were from every different faith group and non, from Muslim, Jewish, Catholic, Church of England, and secular state schools. At the end of the conference, something struck me deeply, enough to persuade me to abandon my prepared talk. For the first time, I understood both the gift and the limitation of the Catholic education that I received about 40 miles from here in the 1980s and the 1990s. During the Shepherd Warlock years, I went to a tough but decent Catholic comprehensive. The values of Catholic social teaching, and especially a formation in the faith vision of the common good, were bread and butter to what we did. Young Christian workers, CAFOD groups, SVP, all of it was basic to our vision of a decent life and how we lived together. Yet watching the interaction of the pupils from across London, I understood that something vital had been missing from the 1980s Catholic vision of the common good, something so obvious that I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed it before. What we did towards the common good in the 1980s and the 1990s in our Catholic community in Manchester, we did largely on our own, perhaps with other Catholic schools or parishes every now and again, but we never did what we did for the common good with our secular, Anglican, Jewish, or Muslim neighbours. It is fitting that we are here this morning in Liverpool because I think the closest thing in the 1980s to what those London schools are doing now was happening here, courtesy of Shepherd and Warlock. As faith communities, we should be proud that we have kept alive a language and a practice of the common good through our institutions during a very difficult period. But surely, part of the challenge to the churches and the faith communities 30 years on is to look towards each other and outwards in new ways. The next generation of challenge is to move from the goods of our multiple civil communities towards new ways in which we can practice relationships of political, social, religious reciprocity and friendship together. Our children are quite naturally learning how to be at the forefront of this work for the common good. They are challenging together, cheek by jowl alongside each other, companies to pay a living wage, learning how to belong in their own streets, setting up interesting opportunities for employer dating agencies in order to get work. They are challenging their communities, their churches and their mosques to talk about issues of the common good and to break down barriers between and within communities. And they currently are the generation who are losing most in our current context. How far, I wonder, are the rest of us willing to go with them?
Thank you very much indeed, Anna. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes. And my suggestion is that people just make comments, unless there's any specific question of clarification directly to Anna. The notion is that this is something we do together. So who wants to make the first comment? Could I also ask people, following Roger's marvellous example last night, if you can try and keep your introduction down to 20 seconds at the very most? Yep.
Hi. It's just a comment about the immigration debate, because I do feel that in the last sort of 5 to 6 years, the debate has moved on. And it's not so much a focus, you know, the common perception and concern, I think, amongst the populace is not about refugees, if you like, but about EU immigration, of which obviously the government doesn't have much control over. And so, in a sense, it's not about, you know, concerns about passports, papers, and sanctuary, but, you know, the way in which the social services are responding to mass immigration from the EU. And I just wondered what the Church's response is to that debate, because it's very different from the debate about the moral case for, you know, sanctuary for refugees. It's a progress and a movement away from the debates about multiculturalism and the Commonwealth immigration from the 50s and 60s. And it's inherently linked to the debate about the living wage, because there's little doubt that immigration has had an effect on wages. And so I was just wondering if you could respond to that. Thank you.
Well, I'm rather keen that we try and keep this with all of us going, so we might ask for a brief response from Anna at the end. Does anyone else want to respond to that comment or make another one? Yep. Up the back there, yes.
And they will, thanks. Often the message they will give is soup or a sandwich, and a reluctance to give that message. So it's moving on from the debate around the common good, I think, to more practical guidance. How can we be honest with people about the support they can access, even if it's an uncomfortable conversation?
I think we've got time for just one more contribution, and then I'll ask Anna to come back, because I'm keen that we've finished the session so that the next speaker has sufficient time. Hang on a minute, the machine's coming across.
I just wanted to ask, are we recording addresses for publication?
Yes, we are, I think the answer is. Philip. Sorry, we need the what's it again. And this, I think, really is probably the last one, otherwise we won't have time to move on to the next person.
Yeah, I think there's a tension between common goods and particular goods. And in my view, there's no such thing as a common good unless there's a particular good. So the Burkean insight, if you will, is we proceed to love of humanity in general by loving human beings in particular. And what I think is missing from this debate is the common good debate, is the necessary love of the particular. And if you love the universal before you love the particular, you're not living in the human world. And actually what happens is you do very dangerous things to the human world. You enforce a model on human beings that isn't human. And so I think that love of nation, love of place, love of culture is an absolute pre-requirement to then move from love of that to love of other people. And I think that And I think that this hasn't been acknowledged in the debate so far. So I would like your sense of where that love of the particular is.
Anna, we've only got about a sort of minute for you to respond, but if there's that microphone's still going, I think.
Is this working?
It's supposed to be.
Is that working? No, oh yeah, it is working. Okay. Whoop. Okay, so briefly on those questions, I mean, certainly I'm not arguing that the main and only debate now is around refugees. I think that, Eliza, you're right, that in a sense the debate, particularly around the stigmatisation of asylum seekers, moved on actually to a debate around the stigmatisation of low-skilled economic migrants. And actually, I think one of the areas where church teaching actually is very challenging at the moment is that it refuses to see low-skilled economic migration as inherently a bad thing or negative. So it actually doesn't want to feed that particular pathology. And actually, I think there is something deeply countercultural there. Almost all of our headlines are about, well, we need economic migration that works in the national interest, and that is basically high-skilled. I think that in terms of human flourishing, there is a wider analysis in common good thinking in the Catholic social tradition that actually challenges that idea. So I just want to say that as one quick thing. But you're right in terms of pressures around EU migration, and I've spent about 5-6 years working directly with migrants who are coming in, so I recognise both the pressures on local services in individual areas, but some of that analysis can be overstated as well, and I'm anxious about the way that analysis is often not grounded in actual communities of practice who will tell more complex stories than that. On the sort of linking that into the second question from the guy at the passage, Catholic social teaching is not a sort of no borders approach at all. It thinks that there is a role for the particular, and it thinks that there is a place for national borders, but that it's not an absolute. So there might be reasons within common good thinking why you might genuinely, in a pastoral context, encourage somebody to think that they might be better cared for in their community of origin than necessarily on their route of migration. It's not necessarily an inherent contradiction, and I think broaching that conversation is a very tricky one, but it's certainly not within, outside of the boundaries of a common good debate to think that you might do that. I agree, Philip, absolutely, that all goods are particular and in context. And in a sense, that's partly why I started with the story about the poem and the I am, because that is about a recognition around the particular and the embodied. And I also agree that place is incredibly important. Where I think you and I might differ slightly is on the role of the nation within that particular kind of theological thinking. And Catholic social teaching hasn't chosen the nation as an a priori good in a way that actually the Anglican social tradition has done much more strongly. So the Anglican social tradition sees nationhood as a direct providential gift from God. The Catholic tradition has never quite seen it in that way, and so it talks about political communities, but it doesn't talk about the nation or the state in quite the same language as some parts of the Anglican tradition would. So I think we'd have a difference over whether or not the nation is a primary or a secondary status in terms of the good. And I think there's a biblical debate to be had over that theologically, but there's also a very important political one. But even within the CST framework, nationhood still has a role, place has a role. People from every tribe and every nation will be presented before the throne of God. There is a sense in which there is a value to ethnic identity, and the very basis of the Catholic social teaching on refugees is, first of all, a right not to be displaced, because we need a culture of the particular, and it's an abomination when we lose that forcibly. So it's not about some kind of abstract system, it is about a recognition of the particular goods. Where the contrast between particular goods and where there's a real conflict, I think, is about who you do in a finite world, who we should let through borders and who we shouldn't, and where the balance is of what a community can maintain. But actually, I think that's back to the kind of analysis you make about the failure of intermediary communities to be involved in really socially creative forms of integration. And it's at the integration level. I think there's been a failure to manage the state-level responsibilities efficiently, but actually I think sometimes intermediate levels have lacked the kind of imagination necessary to make migration work for everyone.
Anna, thank you very much indeed. I've double reason to thank you, because about 18 months ago I asked you to contribute to an edition of Crucible, where you produced something marvellous for us on moral theology, again rooted in real practical issues. Quick advert for Crucible.